I'll never forget. I had a friend I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, which for listeners is a little different than California. I moved out to California in the U.S. And you have these very big redwood trees in California. If you've ever seen those pictures, these California redwoods, they're 350 feet tall. They live thousands of years. They're magical.
Yeah.
They're magical. So when I had a friend visit from New York a couple of weeks after I moved out, and a good buddy of mine, he said, I want you to take me to take me on some California things to do. I'm thinking to myself, I don't know what that means, surfing or wineries, like what's California? I was just getting to know California. But then I was like, what about those redwoods? Like, I've never seen anything like that. That will blow his mind. All we have is concrete and skyscrapers in New York. This will be amazing. So we start walking through the woods, and I'm just in silence. I'm in awe. 5-10 minutes in, he turns to me. He says, "So is there anything to see here besides the trees?"
Jonah Paquette, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's so great to meet you.
Yeah, honored to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
No, it's Richard here, and really nice to meet you. We're meeting you for the first time, but you're a good friend of ours. John Arden has let us know about you, and of course we love John. So anyone he knows is brilliant. Now, we've said a few things about you, Jonah. It's really interesting, this fabulous book. You're interested in happiness, this wonderful book, Awestruck. But we've said a few things, but could you just give us a bit of your sense of yourself and what got you into these areas and got you writing these books?
Yeah, great question. So I'm a clinical psychologist by trade. I'm out here in California, which is where I got to meet our mutual friend, John. I have spent, I would say, the last 15 years or so, really, even as a clinical psychologist, working in more traditional settings, becoming really interested in other sorts of questions that maybe haven't always been the focus of, people like myself, really centering around questions of, like, how do we live our best life? What does it mean to be happy? How do we achieve that? And more recently, I started to get really intrigued by this unique emotion of awe. I started to learn more and more about it. Initially, like probably with many people, got into it on a more personal basis, just started to think back about some of my most meaningful peak experiences, as Maslow would say, and started to think, what is it about these moments that make us want to go, wow, that are so magical, and can they actually change us in ways inside and out? So I had a handful of those experiences that got me at least the ball rolling in my mind, and I decided to do a deep dive into it. And I've always loved to learn through the process of writing. So I spent a couple of years learning everything I could about awe and wonder and how these moments can change us in terms of our mental health, physical health, our relationships, and that formed the basis of Awestruck. But yeah, over the past decade plus, I've written a few books on general well-being as well, and I would say my professional passion centers around that broader area of that question of how do we live our best life, and how do we all find a little bit more happiness in this often challenging world.
Yes, and of course you've two previous books before or were directly about happiness. Just very briefly, just give us a bit of an outline of those.
Yeah, so I wrote Real Happiness, which was my first book, which is more of a self-help book, really focusing on 7 core principles for well-being, including things like gratitude, mindfulness, forgiveness, and a few more. And then launching off from that, I would say it's a sort of a parallel, a companion book of sorts called The Happiness Toolbox, which was more geared towards clinicians and for clients as well. So much more worksheets, handouts, has about 50 plus reproducible handouts and worksheets that you can use to really take many of these skills and put them into action. Because I think, I, like many of us, you hear interesting ideas and you think to yourself, well, how do I do that? And I wanted to make that super easy for clinicians and clients alike, and for the general public, to say, hey, I want to learn, 5 ways I can practice mindfulness more effectively, or 3 ways that I can cultivate that muscle of gratitude. And that's what really formed the basis of that. So I've got Real Happiness, Happiness Toolbox, Awestruck, and then coming up in a few months, I've got Happily Even After, which is focuses on How to Find Well-Being and Joy Following Hardship. A timely book,
Right.
I think, was given the last few years as well.
Fantastic. We'll have to look out for that one. Now I'll have to put you on the spot. Are you happy?
Great question. I get that sometimes. I would say I'm happy more often than I'm not. I'm happier today than I was 5-10 years ago, as a result probably of practicing these. But I think it's important to say you could be spend your life talking about happiness, writing about happiness, teaching people about happiness, and that does not make you immune to life. That does not make you immune to hardship and suffering. And I think actually, in many respects, when we think about happiness, we do a disservice when we think of it as this exclusively, it's all about just feeling good all the time and never experiencing hardship. I mean, so often it's also the more difficult moments of life, the ability to overcome those challenges that actually leads us to be, a more well-rounded, happier person and more resilient person. So I think of it as, we want to make room for the full experience while also cultivating certain habits that I think can make us feel more connected, more at peace, a greater sense of belonging and a greater sense of well-being.
Yeah, that's a great answer, because I think if you have the illusion that we should be sort of bubbling over, in blissful joy 24/7, I think that is a little bit of an illusion.
Yeah, in some ways I have a love-hate relationship even with the word happiness, even though it's in 2 of my book titles and soon to be 3, because I think if we're talking about it in the way that I'm intending to talk about, and hopefully we'll get to that, of like, what do we even mean by happiness? I think that's one thing, but I do think a lot of us have this sort of Hollywood definition of happiness where it's all about just feeling good all the time and no pain and, just every day feels wonderful. And that's just not realistic. And I think when we have that expectation, it's just going to inevitably lead us to feel demoralized when we don't get it.
Yeah,
and this is a huge amount of the we say the Hollywood thing. The Western world does a little bit of about that as part of the we're doing this so we can all be happy. And of course, we've had these wonderful fictional authors, Huxley with The Brave New World, whereas okay, we just be happy all the time, and of course we discover that leads to shallowness, and then you get the dystopian ones, the 1984s, and so on and so forth, and we make you so scared to not be happy, that we make it banal. But I think there you're saying this thing. Maybe what is happiness? A bit conceptual. Because what I was going to say as we were talking, and Matt was saying about how do we do some of this, and you're saying the practical activities. What Matt and I talk a lot about is the importance of understanding left and right hemisphere principles and foundations, and that these conceptual, expansive, more abstract perceptions that come in the right hemisphere, plus these really practical activities and ways of doing things, and then the actualizing of it with the left hemisphere. And it's the flow between which makes the positive work. So we'll get into some of the practicals in a second. So let's just grasp some of these concepts and what you sort of came down, because I think there's a lot of words that get hijacked. We talk about this responsibility instead of it being responsibility and various other things, hope, love. And I think happiness is a big one of those that people say it's an illness not to be happy, so on and so forth. So let's start. Just some of those conceptual things of what on earth is happiness anyway?
Great question. And you could probably ask 10 people how they would define happiness. And I think you could probably get 10 different answers. And I think to some degree, all of us feel like we know it when we see it, or we know it when we feel it, but to actually think about what does it really mean in a deep sense, not just, in a frivolous way, I think is important to get our hands around. So I think, when I write about happiness, and what I try to draw from is most of the more, I would say, positive psychology literature that's has some standing, because I think even there you'll get a mixture in terms of quality and in terms of perspectives. But I tend to think of it, and the definition I like is you're talking about a combination of 3 separate ingredients, 3 interrelated, sort of intermixing ingredients that when we put them together constitute well-being in our lives. The first does have to do with feeling good. This is the sort of hedonic happiness. This is something the Greeks talked about, right? Where it's our emotional sense. Are we generally feeling more pleasant emotions than unpleasant? About the past, about the present, and the future. Am I able to look forward with hope, look back with contentment, feel good in the here and now, feel joy? So our emotions play a role with any, I think, meaningful definition of happiness, but it's actually the least crucial one. Then you've got evaluative happiness or life satisfaction. And if listeners think about that, that overlaps, but it's not a one-to-one. You can think of times in your life where you have felt good in a given day, but not felt all that satisfied with where your life was really at as a whole, professionally, personally, relationally, and so forth. So when we step back and we look at the just broader conditions of our life, if I feel satisfied with that, that's more of that second ingredient, evaluative happiness. And then the third is, for many, the deepest point in this puzzle, which is around meaning, around purpose, more of that eudaimonic happiness, as it's called. So a sense of purpose, a sense of connection and belonging to something that's bigger than ourselves. So feeling good, sort of that hedonic piece, that's one. Evaluative happiness, more feeling satisfied, and then the sense of meaning. And I'll just jump. One thing that really fascinated me from the start about awe and this emotion of awe that really tickled me from the beginning was the fact that it seemed to really directly tap into each of those three ingredients. And even the research started to bear that out of, what it does to us on an emotional level, but also what it does to us in terms of our sense of place in the world, the sense of meaning, purpose, connection, and belonging that it can grant us. So I think that was, for me, one of the, as somebody who likes to think about, write about, explore these questions of happiness, starting to learn and explore more about the benefits of awe and wonder was that I remember early on was one of the parts that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I love this sort of definition that you've just outlined. I do want to ask, so being a musician, a composer, some of the most satisfying times that I've had has been in the depths of melancholy, writing, something that is tragic. And it wouldn't be what you would normally associate with happiness. And yet, I wouldn't want to have been in any other state, especially because, in that state, the creative output, it's the motivation for the creative output. And even if you're not creating a piece of music, you're just listening to maybe a tragic symphony or something like that. And yet these are very satisfying moments. And is that a kind of a happiness, or what would you say?
This is a good question, because I think, to me, it ties very much into that sense of meaning. I think we can come out from those experiences, even experiences that brought us great suffering at different points. Like I can think on a personal level, multiple parts of life, whether it was, a loved one going through a severe health scare, whether it was, a job loss, whatever that might be, that as you're going through it, you're certainly not telling anybody, oh yeah, I'm feeling happy right now. You wouldn't use that word in a million years. But I think as we integrate that into the experience, as we learn about our own resilience, as we gain a depth of understanding of our world, what others have been through, the strength that we have in us, a lot of these experiences that, in the moment certainly don't feel good, I think can still, lead us to become a happier person, for lack of a better term, as time goes on. So it's an interesting paradox. I think of it similar almost to some of the work on post-traumatic growth that's emerging, that's fascinating as well, where you wouldn't ever say to a person like, oh, what you went through was a good thing, quote unquote. But you can certainly look back and say, what I emerged from that was a better person, a better version of me. And it's an interesting paradox when it comes to that. But I think, you brought up the creative process. And I think, if we had some sort of thought experiment where we never, listened to music and felt sad, or created it and felt those moments of those pangs of regret, if we didn't have those valleys of life, I don't think any of us would or should sign up for that. So I think certainly, we want to make room for that full experience. And I think a lot, coming back to the understanding of happiness, what I often talk about or teach about when I'm working with clients around this is, I think what we're really saying here, or what I'm saying is, we want to sort of build our mental muscles for well-being, without having that be interpreted as we have to find ways to suppress or get rid of the pain. Like, we don't want to live in the painful stuff, but we want to experience it. The harder we try to resist it, the more that we're going to experience it. So it's more about, instead of working that very overdeveloped mental muscle, which is rumination, worry, negativity, which we all do very naturally and very easily, we're saying, okay, we've worked on that one a lot. It'll still be there. We're not trying to get rid of it, but we're also trying to see the whole picture, develop our capacity for other sorts of emotional states that we can build and develop.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that we have a natural capacity to go to the breadths and depths of, say, melancholy, whereas maybe we need to work, on breadth and depth of happiness?
Yeah, I think that was what took me all those blabbering words to sum up. I think you just did in 2 seconds. But yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Although I think there's another aspect that my mentor and I, Ernest Rossi, we talked a lot about these things. I want to talk about another word he used in a second, but looking at this thing of happiness, because sadly, we lost a close a young family member to suicide, which led me to think about a lot of these things. And I think it's embraced in the words, the beautiful 3 points you brought up there, but just the wordage we use is when there's a coherence between the inner world and the outer world. And sort of that things like, I'm feeling really melancholy, or I'm feeling really stuff. And then you're sitting at the piano playing and you go, oh, that's okay now. Actually, that's really good. And personally, I had that experience. I was in a very, very bad situation with, I was defrauded. And so it was also to do with my career. Anyway, I felt really, really bad. And I'm a musician as well, not as skillful as Matt. So I improvised a piece on the keyboards, and it recorded it, and so I improvised this piece, and I would just play it over and over and over in my head, and because it was an external thing that made sense to my internal world, and we ended up recording it on a CD, and it's one of my favorite tracks. Not the most popular track, but it's one of my favorite tracks because a friend of mine plays the piece. But this lack of coherence, which is partly what's going on, because we've got this culture, and there's the evaluative, but where you're externally evaluated, you lose that sense of self-satisfaction, sort of like, oh, I don't measure up to the outside world, as if the outside world is the true one. And I think in some of the exercises and activities you've got, particularly in the early one, the happiness toolbox, these are some of the things that you've managed to achieve to just help you come back saying, no, how do you feel about you? Can you think off the top of your head sort of a couple of those activities and exercises that you use to bring that sort of, bring you back to self, back to your own sense of who you are?
Yeah, well, at first I think what you're describing there was so well said, and I think we've always done this as human beings to compare ourselves to what we see around. We're very social creatures, so I think unfortunately what has occurred via technology and all kinds of other ways is that this tendency that we've probably had for tens of thousands of years at least to sort of judge ourselves, evaluate ourselves based on those external metrics has been put completely on steroids by what we're dealing with in 2022. And our brains are probably going to take another few thousand years to catch up to it. Unfortunately, most of us don't have that much time. So we're being bombarded with these, messages of all points. And I think what you're really describing too, and some of my, exercises in those books dealing with, I think, around values and strengths, for example, really speak, that's where my mind goes when you're talking about that, as well as some of the gratitude work, because anytime that we can shift from that, here's how my life should look like, I think, to more of this, what really matters to me question, or what are the parts of my life that I should cherish and I have the capacity to have reverence for and derive joy from, even if it's not what that person on social media might be, promoting themselves. So I think anything with, a lot of values work to me, resonates deeply with what you said, where it's about what really matters to me at the end of the day, not the life that my, father wants me to live or that society tells me I should, but, in this finite amount of time that we have on this planet, how do we want to live? And then I think awe comes right into this too, right? The capacity to experience wonder and reverence in the face of what is, not what should be, right? To find this incredible, magic in the everyday, to turn it into something much more profound, instead of getting so caught up with whether it's self-judgments, whether it's the shoulds, whether it's sort of, pushing ourselves to live the life that we think we're supposed to live, because of those external pressures, as you said. If we can instead step back and say, wow, what an incredible gift to be alive, and how do I want to spend this time, and what do I want really matters at the end of the day? I think that's one of the gifts that the experience of awe can give us, which I know that we'll talk more about too.
Yeah. So can I just ask about being awestruck? Because when I think about that word, I think that's something that we don't really have any control over. It's just something that happens, sort of randomly. We might just be in a situation at a particular time and just see something beautiful, and then we're awestruck.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining now from your work that this is something that we can, what's the word? Maybe not manufacture, but pay attention to in a better way.
Yeah, I mean, do we have things that sort of hold us back from this sort of capacity? Because it's a natural thing. I mean, I love it. I love just going, oh, wow. I was talking the other day with the group, and I was talking about mindfulness, becoming sort of an inherent thing evolutionarily because of sunset. That must, that's an awesome experience. I like to, when I travel around, I've never seen a sunset that hasn't made me go, wow.
Right.
So. Sorry, I just wanted to jump in there with that holding back as well. What blocks us? Where should we go?
Yeah, good question. So I think my mind's going to a few places based on those threads, but I think first there is, I'll just say, you sound to me like somebody that's particularly prone, for lack of a word, to awe. And there are some individual differences based on anything from personality factors. Some of the big 5 personality factors there, have some predictive value in terms of that. So openness, for example, especially, and extroversion, both of which I'm guessing you might be a couple of standard deviations up on.
Well, we help each other with that, which is great.
Yeah. But, I think to what you asked earlier, Matt, was, I think what I tried to answer in the book was, it's a little bit of both, that we can't snap our fingers and feel awe, which maybe I'll just briefly back up. Awe, we can define a lot of different ways, kind of like happiness, but the definition that we'll go with, that I try to draw from that research on, is a combination of, we encounter something that's vast, that's bigger than ourselves, but that also transcends our understanding of the world. So it's vastness plus transcendence, put together would be awe. And you can see how that would apply to a lot of things, right? It could apply to nature, it could apply to a piece of music, a work of art, a moment of connection in session with a client if you're a therapist. It could, watching your kid take their first steps, perhaps. There's all kinds of parts of life that would bring this about. Now, not everybody, you can't manufacture it, to your point. I'll never forget, I had a friend I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, which for listeners is a little different than California. I moved out to California in the US, and you have these very big redwood trees in California. If you've ever seen those pictures, these California redwoods, they're 350 feet tall. They live thousands of years. They're magical.
Yeah.
They're magical. And so I moved, little old Brooklyn boy, moved out to California for graduate school. And one of the first things I did, somebody took me to this grove of these old growth redwoods. And I was just enthralled. It was like love at first sight for me. I felt a profound sense of awe in those, just the ancientness, the beauty. So when I had a friend visit from New York a couple of weeks after I moved out, And a good buddy of mine, he said, I want you to take me to some, take me on some California things to do. I'm thinking to myself, I don't know what that means, surfing or wineries, like what's California? I was just getting to know California. But then I was like, oh, what about those redwoods? Like, I've never seen anything like that. That will blow his mind. All we have is concrete and skyscrapers in New York. This will be amazing. So we start walking through the woods, and I'm just in silence. I'm in awe. 5-10 minutes in, he turns to me. He says, so is there anything to see here besides the trees? It was just fell very flat. What gives me awe might give you or somebody else or a shrug. Now, what I tend to think about when I'm talking about it with audiences, with clients or whoever is, we want to do a couple of things. We want to, number one, put ourselves in more positions in life to experience this emotion. Right. Knowing that, you could go to the Great Barrier Reef, and if you're having a crappy day at work, or your mind is somewhere else, you may not experience awe from even one of those, wonders of the world, but you might, right? And you certainly have a better chance of experiencing it there than you would sitting in front of your, computer or, behind four walls and a ceiling. So I think one thing is just, how do we each day, if possible, even if it's just a walk around the block, that we take some time to notice, even if it's knowing that, okay, sunset's coming, because you mentioned that, how do I maybe once a week go out to a place that could, even if it's a 15-minute, trip from where I live, to go see that, and to put ourselves in more positions. But I think the other piece, which ties into mindfulness, like you said too, is about the fact that we sometimes think a lot about these, I call them capital A awe moments, like Great Barrier Reef and, Grand Canyon here in the US or Uluru or any of these places. And I think we forget sometimes that the everyday stuff is just as magical. We just don't tend to think of it that way. We can be wherever we find ourselves in this conversation, even like the fact that we're having this conversation, how many time zones away through technology like this, that it's mind blowing.
So is it, because I've been writing a little bit about attention and perception based on Ian McGilchrist's work on left and right brain. And it sounds to me that this is an attention and perception issue. And it does sound like certainly the left hemisphere wouldn't have, any appreciation for what did you say, vastness and transcendence that just doesn't compute. So there's definitely a right hemisphere sort of capacity, which, maybe is the reason why a personality like Richard is in awe way more than
the average
someone else.
But sorry, I was just going to jump in. So because this is what's exciting me there. I'm sorry, because I'm jabbing at the bit. But wonder is that left hemisphere springboard. In many respects, I do this with my granddaughter all the time, or the left hemisphere form of wonder in the sense of specifics and details. And with my granddaughter, we used to wander around, walking around the street, and I would make things make noises. I would find the noises in things for it, a metal plate on the ground. I'd stamp it to see what it has. A post. I would hit it with my fingers to hear what it sound, and then we'd hit the thing and the post into something, and it was that sort of pragmatic, sort of functional activity that led to a sense of, oh my God, these things are more. And then we start creating music with these sounds. And just recently, she's only 5 now, but just recently we were walking out and she was walking past a series of posts and a couple of things, and I could see her hitting them as we went along. And I thought, you're looking for the awesomeness, you're looking for the wonder, even when it's not apparent. That's one of the things that holds us back, is the lack of wonder that we seem to have.
That was so beautiful. And I think, to what you all said too earlier, like my friend who I took the redwoods, I'll just go back to him for a moment. He didn't get much from those woods, but he's more of an engineer, and there are things that absolutely fill him and mesmerize him with this just, wow, how incredible. Let me tell you about this energy that for me might go right over my head just based on how I'm wired. And, so I think, for some it's looking out at this beautiful vista and this expanse and feeling small. For others, it might be something like learning about, the universe, learning that there's more stars above than there are grains of sand on planet Earth, and how does that get made? And I think there's sort of like the initial burst of awe that we feel followed by that sense of curiosity. And we can get awe from that too. Like I got one of my pandemic hobbies, I guess, every country where you're listening probably has different experiences of this, but when everything was shut down here in the States, although we didn't do a great job of that either, I picked up a telescope and I started to get really into it. And what I noticed was fascinating was I would experience that sense of awe just from the purely visual experience, looking up and seeing the night sky. But then I started to ask questions that followed that of like, well, what's happening up there? Like, how far away is that light that I'm seeing? How many, years away is that light, distance wise from here? And how does that star up there get formed? And so your mind starts to go to these sort of second order awe places sometimes where you're in awe of the actual initial experience, but then I think tapping into that, the magic of curiosity from that can take you to all kinds of places as well.
Yeah. And that's your left hemisphere stuff, Matt.
That's building. It's building on the whole picture, though, isn't it? So so the appreciation from the right goes to the left, drill down to details, back to the right, bigger picture. Well, now I have to say, because Richard, you mentioned about words being hijacked. I am the worst person for saying awesome to just about anything. Someone says, "Oh yeah, I'll get that piece of I'll get that article back to you very soon." Oh, awesome!
This hot dog, awesome.
Yeah. So my apologies to the world for diluting the word awesome.
You're not alone. Don't worry.
And I think,
and I do it too.
But just quickly in the thing, because diluting it is the stuff. There's just one thing I think I'd like to hear your thoughts, because I actually think this word that I'm going to say has been related to awe is actually a judgmental word, and it's more about human culture and various other aspects, because I think it's this nature of the tremendousness, the extraordinary, in the spiritual things, the numinosum, all these sorts of stuff. But some people define awe as a combination of curiosity and fear.
Mm-hmm.
And that always worried me. I get it.
Yeah.
But I'm not afraid of the grandness and the things. I'm astounded at the various other aspects. But this thing of fear, it's a very humanistic modern culture that, there are things that are unsafe about wonder, about wondrousness. Have you had any thoughts about that, or had any issues in the therapy room with people who are afraid of sunsets because they make them feel too insignificant and so on and so forth?
Yeah. So a lot of interesting threads there too. I mean, like words change, right? As we know, in terms of definitions too. And even the word awe itself, the actual word initially for hundreds of years really was a much more negative connotation, having more to do with like fright and terror.
Yes, sort of awe,
yeah. And then it changed, over time, like words do, and it became more positive. And it was also for a lot of time just a purely religious word. It was only meant to really signify your, relation to the divine. Just thinking about the two examples for earlier, by the way, I just have to throw in, like, it was in the 1700s that two philosophers came along and were like, well, actually, awe isn't just religion. You can feel it through symphonies. You can experience it through sunsets. And it was Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant who listened to, but interestingly, it was Burke who was like, you can hear it through thunder and, animals. And Kant was like, well, you can also get it through ideas and through learning, mind expansive topics and things like that. And here we are hundreds of years later, like so much, just kind of catching up to these people and be like, oh, they were right, 300 years ago. And it turns out they were.
That's right. They were okay. Yeah.
They were right. Okay,
but great ideas do take that time, don't they?
Yeah. Well, and, we're still talking about cognitive therapy 2,500 years after Epictetus and others. So I think smart people are usually ahead of the time, and then we just have to catch up with our mortal brains. So in terms of the negative, and so a couple of things there. One, the definition even I gave you of vastness plus transcendence doesn't have to be good, right? In terms of valence. So it's actually meant to be a little bit more of a neutral description. About 85% of the time when people say like, hey, when's the last time you felt a sense of awe? The answer you get back is something good. But about 15% of the time, it's actually not. So like you could be in awe of these, footage of a forest fire or of a grizzly bear charging. I got charged on a hike a couple of years ago that I write about in the book, and that was an inspiring experience. Now, luckily, it was a bluff charge. Otherwise, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you.
Yeah.
He got within about 10, 15 feet of my wife and I, and to see her run at the speed that she did was awe-inspiring. But I would never want to repeat it again. And once was enough. Once was plenty. So awe can be, awful, to be cheesy and use that term. But to your other point too, I think this is where a lot of the individual stuff comes in. Like I have run into what you've described too, where some of these sources of awe lead us to feel small, lead us to feel at times insignificant. There's even something in that research on awe called the small self effect, which is exactly as it sounds. It means that when we experience a sense of wonder and awe, we tend to feel, and we have look at ourselves as being smaller than prior to that experience in the grand scheme of things. And for some people that can be threatening. For some people that can be very scary. Others, it's like, wow, how cool! I get to be part of this, vast thing. But I think for some people, they may not get sort of a good feeling of awe looking out at the infinite vastness of the ocean. They might get it though through, listening to a beautiful piece of music or going to an art gallery or looking at architecture that they're like, how did that person think up and then build that amazing building? So there's just not a one size fits all that I think is good to remember too when it comes to it.
It's terribly important for the therapist to be attuned and to be aware that would be the case. Now,
sorry, I just quickly, because I like to go on cruise ships every now and again. I worked on one when I was younger, and I do remember standing on a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean, sort of saying, we could be over there. And it would be exactly the same. And there was a particular, awesome sort of feeling. But if I was on a tiny little raft because I was marooned, whatever, and I'd say, my God, I could be over there, I could be anywhere. It would have that awesome but fearfulness side of it. So it is about personal safety. So I think when you find that thing, you check in with why you don't feel safe. That was just a little thought that just sort of passed through my head listening to your fabulous discussion there, Jonah. Sorry, man.
No, you're right. My memory of cruising was as a 10-year-old and in an awesome storm, which was totally freaky out in the middle of nowhere. And so Jonah, give us one or two practical exercises that we can do in the therapy room. And I think we might be able to wrap it up with that.
Yeah. So I think if we stay on the awe theme, as I said earlier, we don't have to go to any far off distant lands. If you can, great, but that's not the idea. What one thing I often encourage people to think about is sort of fusing awe with just this sense of mindfulness and appreciation, however you want to think about that, to think about how many things just in your field of vision right now in this moment. And you could even do this at home if you're a listener. It sounds so simple, but it can actually, if you be a little bit of a screw with your mind, just look around wherever you are, field of vision, and how many things can you pick up that would be absolutely futuristic to somebody from even 50 years ago? And how would they make sense of what you have? And then 500 years ago, and then 5,000 years ago, and then 50,000 years ago. And to just try to recognize every day on a very basic level, how many activities do we engage in? How many parts of our life do we interact with that just would be downright like the Jetsons and futuristic, to almost to 99.99 carry the 9% of human existence. And then, so I think that's one way to say like, wow, this thing that I do every day and take for granted is actually magical. So I think that's one sort of simple, wherever you are type, you have to go anywhere for it. It's just sort of something to think about.
Gaffer tape.
Gaffer tape.
What would when they were building the pyramids, how much help would this have been?
Exactly.
Wow. I never thought about it. Yeah,
so many things that are mind-blowing that we just tend to take for granted. And then I think in a simpler vein, if any of us, even on the hard days, if we step back and we think to ourselves, how many things had to line up exactly so for any of us to have this experience right now that we're having? Even difficult experiences. Like if you start to think about how many ancestors of generations had to survive long enough without getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger? How many near-death experiences had to be survived? How many, how did the particular sperm get together with a particular egg. Some listeners don't want to think too hard about that, maybe, but like, you start to think about times where, basically so much of even once we were born could have gone in different directions. And yet to have this moment right here and right now, like the odds are as close to zero as you get without being zero. And I think when we see things through that kind of vein, through that kind of lens, even difficult, challenging moments can be seen as, in their own way, I hate to say it, but a gift to even have any experience, let alone that one, and let alone the joyous moments can become that much more sweet. So I think stepping back and really doing, that. And then I think the third, if I have time for just one more, is just the simplest one, which is, and I saw that you had a recent episode on this as well, but just, we now are learning so much about sort of the psychological benefits of being in nature and being outdoors. And that's a whole other interesting branch of research. But where it overlaps a lot is people have shown, some of these studies have shown that the more awe that we experience in nature, the more of those psychological and health benefits that we get. So, I think if we can connect to the natural world, which I think so much of a lot of our current struggles are at least contributed by this disconnect from the natural world, that if we can find small ways to feel a little bit more connected to it, I think, and especially when it taps into that experience of awe, we'll be a lot better off for it in terms of our mental health, physical health, all the benefits that I write about in the book in terms of feeling connection and, a boost to our mood and our sense of meaning, and even our health, inflammation. We didn't touch on that, but, there's interesting research showing that when we experience awe, it might even have these anti-inflammatory effects on our body as well. So all kinds of interesting stuff that, I think, but I'd say if listeners leave with one sort of moral of the story, it's just that these moments, as brief as they feel, turn out to matter a lot more than we sometimes think. And if we can just find ways to connect with those experiences a little more than we are right now, we'll be better off for it.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Just wonderful. And actually, my group have been doing some of that genetic work with that pneumoniasis minor, and yes, it does. It's fantastic for inflammatory stuff. Much more work to do. That just it's just so beautiful. And I was actually just being a bit awestruck by the happenstances that actually, through the central thing of John Arden, brought us three together.
Absolutely.
That allowed this conversation to emerge, and for some of those beautiful things you said today to actually now go out. So there's just this flow, and I was just feeling that, like, oh my God, I'm part of a sort of a set of movements that someone will be listening to this at some stage, and they'll get something, and that'll continue on. So awe is that ever continuance of our contributions. So I'm feeling a bit, pretty cool, pretty default mode. I'm just going off into there. So
awesome.
We'll get a bit back to left hemisphere and say thank you so much for joining us and transporting me in those last few moments. And Matt, I know is that we both really appreciate you giving us the time. And is there any last word or two? Or Matt, have you got something?
I was just going to say, let people know where they can find you.
Sure.
Oh yeah, real practical stuff. Thank God.
Yeah, and real practical. Just a huge thank you to both of you. It's funny how things come together, and I'm grateful to John Arden, who you mentioned, for connecting us. And yes, I remember I taught, fond memories, by the way, teaching in few different cities in Australia. It's one of my favorite places I've ever visited. If I ever come back, I'll definitely look you both up.
Oh yeah, we'll have a beer.
For sure. And but yes, you can find me at jonahpaquette.com, full name, jonahpaquette.com. And then you can find me as well on social media. I'm Jonah Paquette PsyD on Instagram, Dr. Paquette all spelled out on Facebook, and same for Twitter. So yeah, feel free to reach out, any listeners, to connect me with me there. And yeah, huge thanks to you both for having me on.
Fantastic. We'll put those links in the show notes. Thanks once again. And I hope it's not the first and last. I hope we do catch up further down the track.
For sure.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Bye for now.